Now, to finally conclude this section here, there's just one last main feature and one last language concept I want to introduce and I want to add to this dummy banking app. And the feature I'd like to add to this app here is that we don't store this account balance just as a number in a variable and therefore in memory as long as the application runs and we lose it thereafter, but that we instead store it in a file so that we can reuse it every time the application starts, and we can therefore persist the account balance across multiple application executions. And thankfully, that's not too difficult to do in Go. And therefore, to implement this feature, I'll start by adding a new function that should handle writing to a file, because I want to add that logic in a new function so that we don't have to add it somewhere in this already existing pretty long code. So I will add a new function here, which we could name write balance to file. Name, of course, is up to you, but should describe what the function does. This function then should accept an input, a parameter, which could be named balance and should be float 64. Because of course I want to get the value, the balance value that should be written to a file as an input here. So to write data to a file, we can import another package from the Go standard library, and that is the OS package. And this OS package now offers a bunch of functions that allow us, for example, to interact with the file system. For example, OS has a write file function, which, as you can see, wants the name of the file to which data should be written, and it creates that file if necessary, so if the file does not exist yet. And then it wants the data that should be written to that file. And that's a strange type. We'll get back to what exactly that type is later in the course with those strange square brackets, but in the end, that's a collection of bytes, you could say. So it wants such a collection of bytes, and then a description of the permissions that should be added to that file. So let's start with the file name, which should be a string. Of course, that name is up to you. Here, I'll name it balance.txt. So that's the file that should be created and where the data should be stored. Next, we need this collection of bytes. Now, one way of creating that is to use the format package and then the sprint function to generate a new string and pass the balance, this float, to it. This gives us a string then. And we could store that in a variable called balance text or something like this. And a string can then easily be converted to such a byte collection by using square brackets and then after them the word byte, and then opening and closing parentheses, which might look a bit weird, but that's the code you need here. And then you pass your text that should be converted to such a byte collection, so to say, between those parentheses to this byte thing here. That will then turn this string into a byte collection, and therefore, since that string contains the float, it's that float that will have been turned into such a collection. Now, last but not least, we must assign the permissions that should be added to this file, and here you can add 0644 as a value, which might look super weird, but that's basically a file permissions notation you will encounter from time to time in programming and when working with operating systems, especially Linux, because this is a way of encoding file permissions. And this set of permissions basically means that the owner of the file will be able to read and write the file, whereas other users that might access the file can only read it. And attached you find a link that allows you to learn more about this way of defining file permissions and how that works. It's not Go specific, but as mentioned, a general way of defining file permissions. But with that, we now got the code we need to store the balance in a file. And to see whether that works, we can now use this function and call it whenever we change the balance. So for example, here, when we deposit something, we can go down here where we updated the account balance and then call write balance to file and pass that updated account balance as a value to this function. And we can and should do the same thing here after withdrawing an amount. And with that, we can give this a try. If you run go run dot, you should be able to check the balance and you should be able to, for example, deposit money. If you do that, you hopefully get no error. And if you then exit this and you take a look at your file system, you should have a new balance.txt file in your project. And if you take a look at that file, you should find your balance number in there. And that's how you can store data in files. As a next step, let's make sure we can also read it.